This is Hannibal from the HannibalTV.com, and I'm with Evan Husney, who is the producer of the Dark Side of the Ring documentaries. The first one is now up on Vice. It's all about the Bruiser Brody killing, I guess you could call it. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me.
So, to begin, how did you come up with this concept? Is this something that was brought to you, or is this something that you pitched to Vice?
No, this is something that I pitched to Vice, and it was like a 3 year, well, it was a couple year process before we got off the ground. But my partner Jason Eisner, who directed all the episodes, um, he and I are diehard wrestling fans. We have been all the way back since we were 6 years old, and we met each other about 10 years ago. He's a film director. He made a film called Hobo with a Shotgun, which is if anyone remembers that. And I had been working for Vice producing documentaries, and we both just kind of got acquainted with the Bruiser Brody story at the same time. That was the first thing that really kind of brought us together. And we were like, man, it would just be so awesome to be able to tell that story on like a grand scale, to be able to produce it as a full television thing. And so we just obsessed over that. We obsessed over Brody. I mean, we bought every Japanese VHS tape on eBay and every poster, action figure, everything. And then we pitched it to Vice as maybe this could be a series, maybe based on this story being so crazy that is ripe for rediscovery, because I think there's probably a couple generations of wrestling fans that probably don't even know this story. And so that was the idea. And then we kind of tried to come up with like six, I think, well, originally we tried to come up with a full season of 10 episodes of different stories we could cover that are kind of on that same level, or tried to be on that same level. And then, yeah, so first we did the Brody episode as a pilot, and then they liked it a lot. And then we got greenlit for the full series, and just were off to the races last year and shot everything last year.
For some reason, I think I already told you this, but when I was in the US for WrestleMania weekend, the
Mhm.
videos were playing, but in Canada, once I returned, they were not playing on YouTube. Do you have any idea why that is?
Yeah, so Viceland, who's airing it, they're the company that's airing it on television. Basically, the premiere date, which is tonight, if you're listening, April 10th, is just in the U.S. only for right now. Unfortunately, I mean, they've had some issues with their cable provider in Canada, even though the show was shot in Canada.
Yeah,
um,
it was shot in Toronto, wasn't it?
that's right. Yep. And so they're in the process of sorting out a Canadian home for the show. Although you should be able to watch it on Viceland.com right now in Canada. But it is coming to Canada, and it's also coming to a lot of the European territories. And so I know been hit up by a lot of our British viewers, and it's coming, I think, in June over there, and Australia in June as well. So it's going to be getting around. This is going to be a little bit of a process.
No, I didn't get to see it, unfortunately, for that reason. I wanted to watch it before I didn't have time to watch it while I was in the US.
Gotcha.
But I noticed that you had Abdullah the Butcher in it. He once told me when we were riding together back when we were friends that he knew that Jose was going to do something with Brody that night, but he didn't know the extent of what was going to happen. Did he say
Wow.
anything to you guys along those lines?
No, I, I'm definitely aware of your saga with him, um, and I, he didn't indicate anything like that to me. However, I will say the experience of interviewing him in his home and all that stuff. I mean, it was really obviously hard to separate kind of fact from fiction. He definitely was putting up sort of a kayfabe front with us, and it really wasn't until we showed him. There's actually a scene at the end of the episode. It's not really a spoiler or anything, but there's a scene where we show him Brody footage, and he kind of like his facade cracked a little bit, and I think he got a little emotional, which is very rare for someone like him, obviously. And he kind of, he even has a tear in his eye, like thinking about it. And so, if that's true, that's crazy. I've never heard that, but I mean, he did make some. Actually, now that you say that, he did say something in the episode, which is there where he made a reference to that he had like 5% of the territory. Like he was going to make 5%, on the territory.
Brody was also, he had money coming to him, didn't he? There was some issues that he was owed money. Commonly, that territory would be late on pay, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, that's what we had heard. David Manning, who's in the episode, very briefly. He's actually he's more predominant in the Von Erich episode and the Gino Hernandez episode, but he
He was a world-class referee for people that don't know.
oh yeah, an amazing storyteller as well. And he told us the story of before Brody had left for Puerto Rico, probably days before I think he left for Puerto Rico for that last trip. He had talked to David Manning about the fact that that they owed him money, and I can't remember exactly the amount of money he says in the episode, but there's a figure there in the episode, and that Brody was very angry, and he was going to do whatever it was going to take to get it back, essentially. And so that was new to me at the time.
And I understand from Dutch Mantel, who I've interviewed, that he found out through you guys that there was only about a 1 hour deliberation of the jury for the actual trial, and that included a lunch break.
Well, that was news that definitely, or that was something I'd heard. I haven't. The problem is it's really hard to get, or it's impossible as far as we know, to get the court transcript, which is something that obviously with the resources of our research team and everything we tried, really hard to get. And Emerson Murray, if you're familiar with him, he wrote a book about Brody. That's phenomenal. It's kind of like an annotated story about everything that went down and also his whole entire career. And Emerson's girlfriend or wife, his partner, she speaks Spanish, and she, back when he was doing the book, maybe it was 10 years ago or something, she called down there several times and tried to get the court transcript. And every time it was like passed on to somebody else. And the eeriest part of the story is when they finally got to the person who could give them access to it, they were like, okay, call me back in an hour and I'll be able to tell you, I'll be able to get it for you. And then they called back, and then this person said, I don't know what to tell you, but the court transcript is missing. Don't ever call back here again. Like, it's not here and it should be, or something like eerie like that. And so I was like, whoa. So that was kind of a challenge for us to try and get it at that point. And it was actually just right around the time the hurricane had hit Puerto Rico, whenever that was. And
Yeah, it was like last October of 2017, I think.
exactly. It was right around the time we were like in the edit of that episode. And it was impossible. And we couldn't find any leads. No one had anything. And that obviously is something that would help. And then furthermore to that point, after we finished the episode, actually, just to go back for a second, when we did the episode, we only, like, since that was our pilot, we only had, a very modest budget to do the pilot. There's always a smaller budget before you go on to do a show. And so we only could interview 4 people for the documentary. But that was kind of also on stylistic purpose too. And after we finished it, we actually got a chance to talk to Savio Vega. And we had heard him on I think Jim Cornette did a thing with him. And his experience of being in or being part of the trial is like the only firsthand thing I've ever heard. And it's super fascinating because he tells the story of like, giving his testimony or whatever, and or being there in the locker room as well, but then giving his testimony later on. And then he actually had an encounter with Jose and his attorney in the bathroom after the trial, maybe when the deliberation was going on. And for whatever reason, he said something unbeknownst to himself, that he said something that the attorneys were very happy about. Like Jose's attorneys were very happy that he said something that Savio was unaware of, that he had said something that helped them out more than anything. And so they thanked him in the bathroom, and that's just like creepy,
One interesting thing, I did see that Savio Vega interview with Jim Cornette, and one
Yeah.
thing that stood out to me about that interview was he said that there was never ever another wrestling show in that stadium, when in fact there was lots of wrestling shows in that stadium after. In WWC, the company where he died, actually put on an anniversary show
Yeah.
about Bruiser Brody every year for years after. And to my knowledge, they never donated any of the money from those events to Barbara or the family. They basically profited off of the guy being killed in the dressing room. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, do you think, like, with as much power as Carlos Colon had there and Victor Jovica and the people that ran WWC at the time, they could have got some paramedics to him before 45 minutes when the ambulance finally arrived, because it seemed like nobody did any first aid in that period when he was just lying on the dressing room.
Two things on that. One, I'm not sure, only because what I've heard, from the people who have wrestled there before, is when people were arriving at that stadium, similar to like WrestleMania or something, it was just like the roads that led to it would get so jammed. So I could see that. I don't know for sure. Obviously, it wasn't there. I wasn't. But
There would have been paramedics, though, you would think, in a
you would think
stadium with 30,000 people, like
that's
within
fair.
the stadium. But
That's definitely fair. I also think too, just from talking to these guys so much about this, over the last few years, but I also have a feeling that, you know, obviously the encounter was very violent, but I think everyone sort of had this impression that, this was horrible, this was awful, this was tragic, but that somehow he would survive this, at the end of it. And I think just literally the amount of time it took to get him medical treatment. And as you'll see, I'm sure you talked to Tony and you've seen other interviews and stuff. As you'll see in our show, Tony goes through exactly what happened at the hospital. And that was a whole nother hurdle to get over to get him the proper attention that he deserved. And I think that also was a huge factor of just how long he had been, unfortunately, bleeding from his wounds.
what do you think about the fallout of that? Jose kept his position with the company and he worked for the company for decades after, literally decades and decades after. Um, and he was considered a hero there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. Like, there was he never got in any type of reprimand. He didn't even lose his job over it. He wrestled that night after killing the guy.
And
But he had time to actually get rid of the weapon first, from what I understand.
yeah, that's definitely a missing piece of the puzzle is where the actual weapon wound up. But one thing is, yeah, that's like the trippy part of this whole thing is just how one person can do this. Obviously, I think everyone would agree, just based on what knowledge we have, that the trial didn't seem entirely fair, especially with the people who witnessed or were at least very close to that incident happening weren't allowed to have their voices heard. And I think based on that, there are some things that definitely don't feel legit about it, to some extent. So for that, I think, yeah, it is kind of surreal that you have someone who did do that and yet their career wasn't sort of, I mean, if that happened today, like imagine if that happened today where WWE travels, off the mainland and then, another wrestler kills another one, it'd be everywhere. So it is kind of crazy that because wrestling wasn't really in the zeitgeist like it is today, or especially in Puerto Rico, I think things would be so much different if it were in a different circumstance.
And if there was the internet back then, that would have made a difference too, because this story didn't even really hit me until YouTube became popular. And now if you search it, there's testimony from lots of wrestlers out there on what happened. But before, it was always very mythical, like what actually happened. Was it self-defense? But obviously, now that we've heard so many versions of this story, the guy walked into the shower room with a knife. You don't do that unless you're planning on doing some damage with it with a hidden knife under a towel. Like,
Yeah, totally. And one of the things that's also like interesting, I guess I can note too, it didn't quite make it into the episode, even though it seems like a very important detail, but we were able to get a hold of all the newspapers from Puerto Rico at the time, which is really fascinating. And we translated all of them, of course, and they're kind of giving little capsule reports on what was being said in the trial. And one of the things that the defense was actually putting forth was that the knife actually didn't originate from Jose. was one of the things that they were trying to say, because there was no proof on who had that exactly. But we can rely, hopefully with through the POV of the people that were there, that everyone, as you know, noticed that the knife was wrapped in a towel around his hand, or that was sort of one of the things people noticed. But that's a detail common among people who were there, and so that's interesting. Just to but then again, for anyone who knows Brody, like, why would Brody wouldn't need a knife or anything,
Exactly, especially with the size difference. And the other thing, a lot of the myth out there is that Brody was a heel and they were involved in a feud, but Brody was actually supposed to wrestle Danny Spivey that night. Brody
Right.
was a babyface. He
Yeah.
wasn't even involved in any type of feud with Invader at the time, and they actually drove together the night before or something. So it's not like there was a ongoing in-ring battle of Brody stiffing Jose. If he had stiffed Jose, it would have been long before that the night. So
Exactly. You've heard those stories. About, about Brody and Jose's sort of rivalry in and out of the ring in other territories and stuff. But there's also speculation out there, which makes it into our episode as well, which is that Brody being, I mean, he made a lot of money in the business, and a lot of people had sort of theorized that he was going to buy into that territory, into the Puerto Rican, into WWC. And and I know, and from what people, it's all rumor and innuendo, so it's hard to separate and find out what's exactly true. But that Brody was maybe wanting to buy in, and he didn't necessarily agree with Jose as a booker, and and of course the fact that Jose's daughter tragically passed away shortly before this incident happened as well, and that kind of is just swirling of emotions. Maybe you're going to lose your job and just mourn the death of your daughter, and you're not thinking clearly, and you bring a knife to whatever. I don't know. I wasn't there, but like it is interesting to look at like all the different details of what people had been talking about and theorizing, and we really leaned into that with the episode to sort of see that, well, this is a really difficult thing for us to kind of figure out without being there, what exactly happened. But this is kind of a chronicle of what all the stories are that people have been talking about over the years.
when you finally got your full funding, did you try it all to get a hold of Carlos Colon or Jose Gonzalez himself?
Yes. We did actually, with the first time around, when we were kind of casting the episode, so to speak, in terms of who we were going to talk to. And obviously, from a journalistic documentary point of view, you want to get all sides of the story. And so we did reach out to both parties, and both of them, I would say, Carlos was reluctant to talk about it, and then ultimately passed. And then Jose was pretty much like a hard no. And so at the end of the episode, when you get a chance to see it, there's a little a nod to that at the end, describing that they had declined to participate.
Now, when I wrestled in Puerto Rico, it was before I really knew the details of the incident. It was before YouTube blew up and everything. But there was the rumor going around that Jose never returned to the U.S. after that incident. Did you ever hear that Jose ever went back to the U.S.?
Not sure. I haven't heard that, but I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, I guess. I mean, I know that through other wrestlers that we've met on the show in the other episodes, when we've mentioned that we've done this story, there have been a few of them who've mentioned that they've had interactions with him. Maybe it was in Puerto Rico, but they've had interactions with him since, and how trippy that was, Especially, I could be wrong, but I think Nick Foley even or something.
Well, yeah, he was a booker. He was still a booker for WWC, but he was actually a booker in Savio Vega's
There you go.
IWA Puerto Rico. That's when my interactions were with him. But when I knew him, I didn't know the full story. But I always did find that he had a huge chip on his shoulder and was a bit of an asshole. But I guess Savio got along with him well enough to work with him in later years in IWA. Um,
Wow.
But there's so much to all of these episodes. I think we may have to do separate interviews for a lot of the episodes. But do you want to quickly go through some of the episodes? We've covered a lot of the same stuff on our YouTube channel. I know Gino Hernandez's death. I've delved into quite a bit. I'm looking forward to that episode as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you some context, like when you were describing, like when when YouTube was started taking off, and shoot interviews were accessible, and other people just talking about this, that was really a huge part of our research and inspiration. So we've definitely seen a lot of your interviews that you've conducted, and that's been a resource for us doing this too. Like that's where we first started hearing about this stuff. And to segue into Gino Hernandez, that was I had never known him, heard about him growing up as a wrestling fan. It's totally off my radar, and it wasn't until Bruce Pritchard's podcast where I think it was about Houston wrestling, where he kind of gave a quick summary of who he was, why how he's such a perfect example of like a wrestler living their gimmick back in like the kayfabe era, which is so amazing, and how he really was the character that he portrayed, and at the same time his death obviously shrouded in so much mystery, and that was really interesting to me. And we convinced all parties at Viceland on like a wing and a prayer to kind of let us investigate this story, even though it's all based on rumor and it could just not be true. It could be that he just died with a drug overdose and that's it. And it was crazy for us when we actually got to get in touch with his family, and we got to know their family, his family, really well. Gino's mother is still alive, and that was just I can't. I mean, I'm not going to spoil anything. I think everyone should see it, but it's a wild ride in terms of there's a lot of interesting. It's all pretty much all new information because the family basically has been living in fear for their lives for 30 years and hasn't told their story since. So
The
that's
red,
yeah.
the red flag for me on that is just that the cocaine was found in his stomach because you're not eating cocaine, even if you're have a massive addiction. For the most part, you would snort it or smoke it, but like to eat it is weird.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that is we actually did talk to a lot of experts in criminal pathology for that, and we got a hold of the autopsy report. We have the autopsy report, and we looked at it and we talked to some people. And given the fact that and you'll see some of this in the episode, but given the fact that he was found basically 4 or 5 days after he had passed, and because of the decomposition, sometimes all of that stuff finds its way into your stomach, and so it's really hard to kind of, because of the decomposition, it's really hard to do the correct amount of, tests to find out exactly where this originated from. Did he have a lot of it in the system? Absolutely. But, still, the more fascinating thing is that, you're gonna hear from some people that have nothing to do with the wrestling business that were pretty close to Gino. So, little tease there.
Well, nobody denies that he was connected with the underworld. No one denies that, and no one denies that he was involved with drugs. So
Yeah.
there's definitely a possibility there, if nothing else.
So you'll definitely hear from some of those characters.
And you did another episode about the Hogan and Macho Man saga, I guess.
It's actually more about the Randy and Miss Elizabeth saga.
Okay, another subject I've covered a lot.
Yeah. I mean, these are the greatest hits. So what we wanted to do with that episode, however, was not just highlighting the tragic element of it all, or just even the Miss Elizabeth portion of it all, in terms of her passing. We really wanted to also tell kind of like an epic Romeo and Juliet love story, about like who they were behind the camera and who they were in front of the camera, and how those worlds often intersected. Because for people who aren't wrestling fans who are going to be watching this, it's going to be fascinating for those people to see that overlap and to see how that all kind of works. And for us, we wanted to tell the whole story from before WWF when they met all the way through to WCW when they're divorced in real life, but yet still engaging in the storyline involving their relationship. And so that was the idea. And also to kind of make it a little lighter and more fun than some of the darkness that's in the other episodes. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one ridiculous story, like I believe a lot of the stories, but one of the ridiculous ones when was Hogan said that he had built like a cage on the front door of their house, Macho Man and Elizabeth, when they lived together, and he would lock the cage door when he would go.
No, I mean, no.
Hogan actually
But
said that, by the way. I'm not making this up.
that's insane. Yeah, who knows, man? But obviously something was going on there, and it was a little intense, we'll say. But yeah, I think a lot of that stuff is just wrestle talk. you know.
So that's three of the episodes. What else? What else is on the plate here?
Um, so one of the episodes that we're also doing is a story about the Von Erich family, another subject I'm sure that you covered. And we spent a lot of time in Hawaii with Kevin, and that was an incredible experience. It's an incredible experience to hear him tell his story, and even he's remarked on social media since then that this was the most open and honest he's really been about his family story, and that definitely comes through in the episode. You're definitely going to see that, and that was just the most probably emotional episode for us all to work on because it's such a tragic story. We did an episode about the Montreal screw job. A lot of fans will probably be like, well, that story's been told before. But, keeping in mind that this show also, I think what was something we really tried to do with this series is we tried to make it accessible to non-fans. And so I think if anyone who is a hardcore wrestling fan like us, uh, you could watch this with anybody, friends, family, or whatever, who don't really care or know anything about this, and they're going to get just sucked into this. And that was the aim. And for my money, the Montreal Screwjob, in terms of like contemporary wrestling stories, is one of the more fascinating ones because it deals a lot with the work shoot kind of concept, and then it also deals a lot with workings of the WWE, which that incident proved was more interesting than kind of the storylines they were writing. So that's kind of the first moment when the fourth wall broke down. And so that's the kind of angle we get at it. And I can assure you, there is a really interesting new tidbit of information in that episode that hasn't been out there before. Um, and then the final episode that I think we're on the sixth one now is we did an episode about the fabulous Moolah. And given that the sort of controversy from last year with WrestleMania and naming it the Fabulous Moolah Battle Royal, and WWE had to remove that because of the sponsors. We sort of took that as a way to kind of re-examine her history because now we're in this era of kind of a post-Me Too, moment where their legacies are being re-examined and separating art from artists and that sort of thing. And we felt that was kind of an interesting thing to look at the women's wrestling power broker and all the rumor and innuendo that's kind of around her and trying to tell as many stories for different women that we could. And that's what we did. And so that episode is kind of a look at her complicated history.
And I'm gonna guess Jimmy Snuka might be a future subject if you guys are doing more down the road.
It would be interesting because believe it or not, when you see the Gino Hernandez episode, it's actually not in the episode, but when you see it, Gino's mother was actually married to Jimmy Snuka for 10 years, which is like the weirdest thing. And
Yeah.
nobody really knows that. And I didn't know that. And so if we do get a second season, that might be an interesting take on the whole thing. And we originally did set out to make more than 6 episodes originally, but as production's harsh realizations can happen, and so we had to make some unfortunate sacrifices at the end where we basically had almost an entire Dino Bravo episode completely shot, which we have done. And so that one, pray for a second season, we'll be able to finish that one finally and get it out there.
Oh yeah, and I've done extensive interviews on that one too. That one is definitely something that would be great to have a big
Yeah,
media outlet like you cover. But I'm really happy that you're bringing to light the Bruiser Brody thing. Unfortunately, I don't think that the federal government in the U.S. is ever going to reopen that case, but at least more and more people will know about it, and hopefully it will
yeah.
make Invader's Day last days that much more miserable since he got away with it.
I mean, Yeah, I mean, like the more people that see it, it's definitely going to be broad. This is going to be on a bigger stage, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time with us. Do you want to let us know again where we can watch that and where we could follow you personally for all the
Yeah.
latest updates?
Yeah. So again, the show is Dark Side of the Ring. It's airing on Viceland. Right now, it's in its 6 week run, so every Wednesday at 9 p.m. if you're in the U.S. And then don't worry, everywhere else, Canada, Europe, Australia, England, we're going to be getting that out there to you guys shortly. And you can follow us on social media, on Twitter at Dark Side of Ring, and then on Instagram we're at Dark Side of the Ring, and that's kind of where all the info is going to be getting out. And also we're going to be dropping clips and deleted scenes, and is Gino or is Paul Bosch Gino's father? That kind of stuff is going to all be hitting on there.
Yeah, I've heard those rumors too, and that goes back to Gino's mother again, so that's interesting. And if you
Yep.
do another season, you should consider the whole Abdullah situation with me because that's a pretty dark side of the ring as
It
well.
really is. It really is, man. I
And it
can't
was
believe.
actually the first time in history that a disease transmission was proven in court, and he was
Oh,
found guilty in both Canada and the U.S. Yet
wow.
to pay. But as you saw by his house, he actually has two residences. He's not doing too bad financially, but he's good at hiding his assets and switching the names of everything. But
Crazy.
thanks a lot. I'm really looking forward to watching these, and maybe after I watch them, you could check in with us again, and we
Yeah,
can discuss them further.
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much.
Good job. I really appreciate that you're bringing this to light to possibly a new audience.
Thanks, man.